Welcome to episode 21 of the Lily List podcast, where our goal is to be a handbook for the living. In this episode, we connect with Thomas Brown, a writer, cyclist, and mental health advocate whose journey of loss, self-awareness, and resilience has shaped an extraordinary perspective on life. Thomas shares how personal trauma, including the loss of his brother to suicide, set him on a transformative path of emotional growth, creative exploration, and impactful action. From walking across the country to riding 7,000 miles for suicide awareness, Thomas reveals the lessons learned, the importance of self-awareness, and his inspiring vision for leaving a meaningful legacy. Tune in as we explore his profound insights on emotional wellness, the complexities of codependency, and the healing power of storytelling. As always, visit lilylist.com for more information on the podcast and platform. You can also contact us from the website if you have questions or ideas for people or topics you'd like to see us cover in the future. If you'd like to support the work of Lily List, you can donate using the links in the description, and if you find these conversations meaningful, we thank you for liking, following, sharing, or subscribing wherever you listen. Thomas Brown, thank you for joining the Lily List podcast. Happy to have you on.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. Super grateful to be here.
What were some sort of impactful moments for you when you were coming up?
My parents, they put a roof over our head, food on the table, clothing on our backs. It was just me, my brother, and my parents. My parents came from a simple time in a simple place in Kansas. My dad, I think, was born in Derby, my mom in Wellington, and those two towns are very close to each other. And when they were raising two boys in the 80s, technology was ever changing, ever expanding, ever growing. And, Phoenix is just way bigger of a city than Wellington, Kansas. My parents taught a lot of compassion and empathy, but outside of that, they weren't like wizards or sorceresses. I think they were just as confused about life and thus raising two confused boys. My brother was always kind of like the golden boy of the family because he was the oldest one. He could never do no wrong. And I think as we got older and I got into high school, he was 6 years older than me. He kind of became like a womanizer. He was a singer. He had a lot of charisma. And he was hurt by a woman when he was like his second year in college. I was like in seventh grade at the time. And when he came back, he was just different. He dropped out of college. He was going to Northern Arizona University, came back down here, and he was just different. We still had a good time, but like he ended up having two primary girlfriends by the time I was in high school and a bunch of other conquests in between. And to him, like that's what manhood was. He was never going to let a woman make him feel that way again. So he was going to manipulate his way any way that he could. And like my parents like just didn't know how to handle that type of behavior. He had asked for like a door to be built onto the bathroom to the backyard. And he literally would have one woman coming in through the front and a woman like leaving out the back at my parents' house. It was crazy. I didn't agree with what my brother was doing. I didn't understand why he was doing it. I was never a type of player. I didn't have that kind of charisma, or if I did, I didn't know how to use it. I'm glad that I didn't at that time because I value relationships and I like to learn from my partners and grow from my partners. The other thing that I did gain from my parents, besides their compassion and empathy, is a little bit of good old fashioned codependency. And I think they're very codependent on each other. They didn't like to be separated very much. I had like this older brother that was turning more towards a dark side of intimate relationship. I had my parents that just didn't do well away from each other. And I kind of adopted another. And that has been my ultimate plight in life. Outside of like the fact of losing my brother to suicide, every trauma that I've really suffered has stemmed from that codependency. And it's really like, the metaphor is like me seeing like a train wreck into some toxic factory and thinking that it's a good idea to go streaky through it and then being upset that I'm injured on the other side of that run and just being like, oh, why am I injured? Why am I all hurt? Why am I all scraped up? Like, why did this happen to me? So a lot of the trauma that I experienced after my brother's death was self-inflicted traumas, putting myself in situations that weren't healthy for me, that weren't good for me, and then, wondering why I was hurt on the other side of it. So that was pretty much my childhood into my young adult stuff.
How old were you when your brother had passed away?
I was 24 years old. He was a few weeks from his 30th birthday. So, yeah, that was weird. And a lot of people look at suicide and they get upset at the person that's gone. And there's a lot of like resentment and anger and frustration. I didn't really have any of that. I was concerned about my parents. My mom found my brother. My dad never fully recovered emotionally. And this was in 2001. Even though I did not have any of the tools to manage my own emotions properly, I was like, I'm going to just concern myself with my parents. That was just, it was like, I didn't have the tools to handle myself. And yet I thought I could manage somebody else's emotions. And it was dumb. So I would party excessively on the weekends to kind of like cope with trying to help them and manage their feelings and their grief and what they were going through. And it just wasn't good. But the thing that's interesting is that I've always been like an emotional person. I've always been willing to express myself emotionally. I'm not like one of like a dude's dude that only expresses joy and anger. You know what I mean? We run the gambit of the wide variety of the emotional spectrum. And I'm glad that I did, that I didn't like suppress any things. But one thing that I wouldn't do is that I wouldn't put a label on it. And I don't know if it was like out of fear of rejection or anything like that, but I just didn't want to ever say like I was depressed. Like I was afraid of what that might mean to my peers. I obviously was. I was going through some stuff that I couldn't manage and I couldn't handle. And it wasn't until so my brother died in 2001. It wasn't until 2008 that I was like, man, I need help managing this shit. I need a professional. I'm going to go find like a therapist. And so it took a long time to be able to look at what I was going through emotionally. And I wouldn't say that my brother's suicide was the thing. Like I already had like a tremendous amount of codependency. And with codependency, I was stunting my own growth as a person because of my codependent behavior. And that was contributing to any type of sadness or depression that I was going through, is that I just wasn't growing. And there were things that I was passionate about, but I was too afraid to attempt them. Right around 2006, I finally started to go into a creative direction and start working on those passions, but I still hadn't admitted that I was depressed. So in between the time my brother died in 2001 and 2008, I did have some mountaintops that I climbed and there were some things that I achieved. But the one thing that was missing was the mental part, the mental and the emotional part. Once I got to that, my life really changed. I learned in 2006, I went on a walk across the country with a group of progressive Christians. And I myself am not Christian, but I was the production assistant for a documentarist that was going along with that group too. So it was like one part theology on the road, one part film school on the road. And it was the first time I had ever been east of Wellington, Kansas, Wichita, Kansas. And so I learned a lot, just about the country that I lived in. And I gained some needful perspective. And I was able to break free of some of the codependent shackles that I had on me, but I still had that one more hump that I needed to achieve. And it took me 2 more years until 2008, until I finally walked into a therapist's office. And if I hadn't made that decision, I don't think I would have ever done the bike ride in 2012. So,
well, there's a lot there. But to step back for a second before we get to the bike ride, is you mentioned sort of codependency tendencies. You feel like sort of maybe you grew up with them, saw them with your parents and kind of adopted them. Who am I? How am I going to live? But with you, before kind of this big impact with your brother, obviously he was having some impact before that. And then you've got your parents and everybody else. I get the sense that you've always kind of had the emotional aspect, right? So, you mentioned before you weren't kind of the guy's guy, but it feels like there was something there where you were maybe a bit more in touch with your emotional side than maybe your brother might have been.
I think that he had an understanding of it, but he used it, he went to the dark side with it and tried to manipulate it. Like before, like a couple of years before he died, he was dating this girl that I grew up with. He was 6 years older than her, got permission from her parents when we were still in high school, when she was 16. Then the other woman he was dating was my boss. And I was like right between all of that. And I'm like, man, I don't want to deal with any of this shit. And once I was done with high school, I didn't really go to like college right away. I wanted to, but like my friends weren't. And so I was like, oh, I don't want to miss out on anything that could, you know what I mean? So, which is just like super dumb. But, we were all smoking weed and eating mushrooms, doing ecstasy, doing a lot of cocaine. But like, I was like, whatever. I guess I'm just having fun for the first few years after high school. And I just didn't want to be a part of associated with like my brother's lies. He didn't like that I was a party animal or that I raged, on the weekends. But I didn't, I was like, yeah, but I'm not really cool with like your lying and you just keep me out of it. And because he couldn't keep tabs on me, like that put like kind of strife between him and I. And even if I just didn't want to be a part of it, I was a variable he couldn't control and he didn't like that. So, and then on the other side, like the woman that was my boss, she was an asshole. It took her a few years after my brother died that she was like, yeah, I was just taking it out on you because it didn't get me anywhere to like confront him with it. Was that both of the women, and I'm not saying this that I blame them, but they both got wise to his charade and they bounced on him. So this illusion that he had created, in order to sell a lie, you kind of have to believe a lie. He believed it too much. And when they went their separate ways and he lost both of them at the same time, like he freaked out. He freaked out. And because, it's not manly to talk about your feelings, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s. Like, I feel like over the last decade and a half, we've moved a little bit more towards that for men. You still have your outliers like your Andrew Tates in the world that are trying to fight against that emotional expression of men. But for my brother back in 2001, like that was just like, no, I can't tell people the reason why I'm losing my weight, all this weight is because I'm heartbroken, because I fucked up and I manipulated two women for a decade and I'm heartbroken now. So instead, he just told everybody he had cancer, and then, there was no proof, anything. He wouldn't let anybody go with him to the doctors. He wouldn't let anybody go with him to treatment. And there was never any receipts that anybody saw or anything like that. So yeah, it was just like another one of his stories. Like, people will actually feel sorry for me if it's like a physical thing. They won't tolerate if it's just an emotional thing.
Yeah.
Like that was like his belief system. So he just didn't allow himself to have the space and the time and a professional to help him and teach him the tools that he would need to heal emotionally. So I don't get into it in my book. It was in one of the earlier drafts, but I decided to save that for maybe like a follow-up, more of a philosophical observation of mental health in this country. Code of our society is that men are told to act a certain way. You'll have the Jordan Petersons of the world that will say shit like, well, if it's a patriarchal society, why are more men in prison? If it's a patriarchal society, why are more men in combat positions? Because a patriarchal society demands that they're the ones in those positions. Like, you're the one with the doctorate. Why does somebody without a degree need to explain that to you? It was like that idea of what a man is supposed to be and what a man is supposed to represent that my brother bought into, that eventually led to his mental health downfall and what killed him.
Yeah.
So,
well, so, you mentioned the part about after he died and being there for your parents, and it has to be dealt with going through that period from 01 to 06 and then going to a therapist and the walk across the country. And then you started to touch on the bike ride. What does that look like for you? Obviously, it's your brother. it impacts you regardless. You can't help feeling and looking sad after it first happens. But how do you force that down, focus on things, and then what happens to actually make you go to a therapist?
So I went on the walk with a group of people in 2006, and that was like my first separation from like some toxic relationships. I had a friend that I'd known since like second grade. And after high school, we reconnected because he went to a different high school and we just party our asses off. And like we were both always into film and always into like comic books and writing and all that. And I would be like, hey, instead of us getting fucked up tonight, like, why don't we like go somewhere and like write some stuff and like work on things? And that never happened. Like, he was like, oh, yeah, let's smoke this joint first. Then he put on a movie and then he just like laying. And it was just always that over and over again. And so, like, the walk was like a way for me to break away from that. I was still in an intimate relationship, which was equally toxic. And I came back to her once I was done with the walk and I was in film school. She was horrible. She was just as horrible to me as he was to those women. And like, you know, I was just super codependent on her. And I finally, when I went to therapy, I knew that I needed help and I wasn't going to like just walk away. Her hooks were in me, man. And I didn't know how to get them out. So I went to therapy and that kind of like helped me. Like, I mean, she tore me open. My therapist just completely tore me open and unraveled every single layer there was to me. And we went all the way back to my family and how the family dynamic and all of that way before we even touched upon. We went through everything that was happening in my brother's life, like in between him and I before his suicide, after his suicide. It was a few sessions before we even got to why I walked in there. And she took me on a journey of self. And I realized the importance of self-awareness and how it's just an aspect of our world that has a profound lack of self-awareness. And there's no setup in any institution that helps one cultivate a great sense of self and how to manage one's emotional self. And you either come to that journey on, I mean, if you had just like a curiosity about certain things, but for the majority of us, you come through it because you need like a humanities credit or something for your degree. So you take a philosophy class or a mythology class and you have your mind blown open or cracked open, or you suffer a trauma and you eventually find, you know, you crack open and you need to pick up the pieces. And if you can do that by yourself, that's cool. For me, I needed somebody else to help me out. I'm kind of like a slow learner. So yeah, there was a lot of these things that led to me knowing that I needed more help and then getting into therapy and learning the great importance of self-awareness and understanding of like, why do I do the things that I do? Why do I believe the things that I believe? Why do I respond? Why must some responses be volatile? Who am I outside of the filter of my meat suit? Which is very, very important. It helped me to also grow some apathy and compassion for myself and my journey, but also helped me to have a little bit more spatial understanding of my environments and then social awareness and expanding my levels of compassion and empathy for other people who have different meat suits, thus different experiences in this reality. And if I hadn't had that experience, yeah, like there's no way I go on this bike ride.
Yeah.
It's just not going to happen. I didn't go on the bike ride to heal. I feel like I transmuted through my trauma and I was just more curious about other people's experiences. Cause like I shouldn't judge a phenomenon based on my experience. I want to know if I really want to know about it, I need to hear as many different perspectives as possible. And so that's really what the bike ride was for me. So, you know, in 2010, I met a guy who had lost his brother to suicide and was the first person outside of my experience that had the similar experience of suicide. And it was also the same connection, albeit his relationship with his brother was much less contentious than mine was with Mark. But like it's still like having my community expand by one was very profound. And, you know, 6 months later, after like, you know, starting our friendship, we talked about the idea of the bike ride. January 2010, June of 2010 is when we have the conversation about the bike ride. February 2011 is when we decide we're going to do it. I think it was like Super Bowl Sunday. And then it was 13 months of preparing for it. We finally launched on March 1st, 2012 at the northern edge of the Golden Gate Bridge and crossed the bridge. That was our first like mile or so of riding, was going across that bridge on a wet, windy, cold spring morning in San Francisco. It took us 12 months to get to our destination of the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors in upstate New York.
Obviously, profound experience. I mean, just even planning for a year and then actually putting a year of your life into it. Biggest takeaways from that, I'm really curious, positive and negative, because I'm guessing that there had to be something you learned that
Oh, yeah.
was not positive, right? And then obviously, I'm sure you learned a lot of positive things, but most impactful or meaningful to you, I'd really love to hear what those were.
I would say like the negative thing isn't really negative, but it's a great lesson. Even the things that are worth doing that you love, you're going to have those benign moments that are just completely like they're just boring, like when your ass is
You still gotta show up.
yeah, you still got to
Every
show up like
time.
no matter what. And like when you're riding south in Kansas, going up and down hills in headwind for 60 miles and going uphill is easier than going downhill, it's demoralizing.
Yeah.
And you're just like, why do I always get the headwind? And you just it's a pain in the ass. But I would say like there's two primary things that I really learned. Frank Campbell was a suicidologist and thanatologist that we met in Baton Rouge, and he talked a lot about you can't be your trauma. You have to grow and learn from your trauma. You can't be your grief. You have to grow and learn from your grief. So I remember just we were in Pensacola a few weeks after that conversation with him. We were in Pensacola. We were with our host. She had lost her brother to suicide as well. And we were in this like little cove on paddle boards, and we'd been paddle boarding for a few hours. And at this point, we're just kind of like laying on our paddle boards, like circling each other. And it just like I saw everything. I saw my entire life like a story, all the ups, all the downs, all the moments of happiness, all the moments of despair, and it all led to this moment of this me finding this great sense of peace, laying on my back on a paddleboard in a cove in Pensacola. And I was just like, all the bullshit, everything. I had this overwhelming sense of peace that I'd never had before. And none of it would have like, how does it happen if all those things before didn't lead me to that moment? You know what I mean? And so I started to like really like, wellness folks will say that like, happiness and sadness, it's just a choice. You just have to decide. But the fine print of that is that there's this epic journey one must go on before they realize that there's a choice. So it's not like you just like somebody tells you it's a choice, stop being sad. And you're like, oh, I wish somebody would have told me that before. I'll just decide to be happy. It's not really about that. There's this epic journey that one has to go on. And I think it's more in line with what Frank Campbell said, is more than just a choice. It's just like, hey, like this horrible thing happened to me. Now what? So do I want to be a victim of it, or do I want to be a student of it? It's a great place of privilege for one to be at that moment where they're like, am I a victim or am I a student? So the way I also lay it out is that existence is just this experience phenomenon. Things happen and it doesn't judge it as being good or bad. It just is. It's an experience. So a good experience will lead you to something bad, and a bad experience will lead you to something good, and it's just important for you to like recognize that this is an experience and what am I supposed to get from it, And I had this conversation yesterday. It's like somebody's like, you look at every single moment that you're in as just an experience. I was like, yeah, I'll have a lot of emotional feelings when I'm experiencing it, but I also understand that this is a lesson for me. I can allow this to be a lesson. I could be really pissed off. I could be really sad. I could be feeling a great amount of like grief and despair, but I still know that this is just an attempt for me to level up, and it may take a while for me to get to that point. It may take a while for me to learn the lesson of this experience, because it's important to feel. You can't subjugate your feelings. You have to allow yourself to feel like that stage of experience before you can learn the lesson from it. And then the other thing was just that once we got to the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, I'm a big fan of the band Tool, and Alex Gray is the artist who owns the Art Retreat Center of the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors. And I was just watching how people that we were there, we got there, and a few nights later, we spoke at their full moon celebration that they do every single month, and we got to tell our story. But once the presentations were over and we were all just having a good time, I just watched how people fell over themselves just to be next to Alex. And I was kind of befuddled by the idea that we'd all rather stand next to greatness than cultivate our own. And that I think that like when it comes to like art and audience, that there's this like unspoken transaction that takes place of energy, and that, the true magic is the inspiration that you get from watching somebody do something amazing that you enjoy, whether it's music or a movie or a book or art and paintings or poetry. Is that if you're moved, there was this transaction of inspirational energy given to you, and it's up to you to go and then now use that in your life to create something beautiful, even if it's just for yourself. It's not about like making money out of it. You're a master or not in that art form or that craft, but like you're supposed to keep that transaction moving. And that could just be for you, or it could be for somebody else, just for an audience of one. But I think that when you waste that energy, it just turns into adoration, and you kind of disempower yourself and become more of like a slave to the idea of like icon and celebrityism and all that bullshit. So like those are the two lessons: just be in the moment, learn from it, understand that whether it's painful or it brings joy, there's a lesson to be learned to help you evolve your character, and know the difference between adoration and inspiration. One's better for you. One's better for your circle of influence too. So those are the two things that like really like that I've taken with me. Like I don't write thinking that I'm going to make a living or that I'm going to become a millionaire. Anybody who gets into like any type of art form thinking that it's going to pay all the bills and solve all their financial woes, I think you're getting into it for the wrong reasons. I think you need to do it because if you don't, it's like air or water or food. If you don't consume those, you're going to die. And for me, if I'm not working on a project and creating something, I will wither and die.
So, given all of that and those learnings, where are you today? What are you working on? What are those things that you, knowing that they can change as we go forward and as we evolve through our experiences? But today, where are you today, and what
Yeah.
what are those big things that you want to push out there in the time that you've got left?
Well, in May, I published my first book, 2012, A Bicycle Odyssey, which is a 7,000-mile bicycle journey for suicide awareness and the healing power of art. Like that was my very first book, self-published, had 3 different editors that, just beat the shit out of me and brutalized my writing, but challenged me to be better and be more present with it. And I really like writing. So there's 2 projects that I'm working on. One is the follow-up to this book, which is where this book is more of an adventure book, memoir, telling the tale of why I did the bike ride itself, and then the journey home. The next 2 that I'm working on, one is a follow up to 2012, more of my personal philosophy of mental health and the importance of self awareness. I don't expect it to be as long. I think I can get it all in there within 50 to 75 pages. So hopefully it won't be like a long book. But then the other one I'm working on is where if like 2012 is the book that I needed to write, I'm working on a project that I want to, and it's more of a fiction. I'm a big fan. I'm very curious and about Gnosticism. And so I'm writing an anthology of short stories that tell a modern day Gnostic tale. So it started with a screenplay that I wrote in film school back in 2010. It's based on their song Rosetta Stoned. It's now grown into like 6 mini stories that, some of the characters jump back and forth from one to another. I mean, if there is going to be like a theme between like my memoir, this fictional sci-fi, And the follow-up to 2012, I think like even in like fictional stories, the importance of self-awareness and knowing who we are as individuals and as a people is important, you know? Because to me, like self-awareness is the only game in town. To me, it doesn't matter what your religion is, or if you don't know who you are, you're easily manipulated by others. You got an entire world telling you who you should be and what you should be doing rather than you understanding who you are on a fundamental level.
Yeah, you have to understand self before you can truly understand others. So
Mhm.
that's a big one
It's
with
never
that.
ending, too. It's never ending. Like cradle to grave. Once you die and the ego that is attached to the character that you are in this embodiment is gone, on to the next level of experience, whatever that may be, if it even does exist. This ego of Thomas will be learning and unraveling until the day it decays and is gone. There is no mountaintop. As much as you can learn. As soon as you get to one summit, you're like, ah, Christ.
You mentioned the sort of hero's journey, right? And at
Yeah,
the end of the day, it's a journey. There's no destination at the end of it.
no.
So that's a good pivot point to I always ask about legacy and I don't care about the financial aspect of it. I think there's more important aspects of who you impact or who you want to impact and how you would like, Thomas the ego, right? How do you want to be seen by these people? What do you want to leave behind from your experience here that can impact those people as they go forward?
So there is this movie called The Lady in the Water by M. Night Shyamalan. It's one of his movies that got panned, but I really enjoyed it because it's all about the power of storytelling. And M. Night even plays a character in that he's a struggling writer, but ever since he was like he interacted with the nymph, the sea nymph, like she inspires people, his thoughts became clear and he's just writing like this philosophy book, and it his book is going to piss a lot of people off and he's going to be murdered for it. But somewhere down the line, some kid from the Midwest like is going to find it, read it, and it's going to inspire him to get into public service and he's going to be a great leader for the country. You know what I mean? There's like that scene always is like that's so dope. Like he's he was a marginalized and divisive writer who didn't sell anything, didn't make a living as it, but somebody found his writing and did something with it. So like I worked with children in after school programs for about 14 years. And I know there are some schools that do, have like kind of like a meditative practice involved in their curriculum. I would like to write a curriculum. I'd like to get with some professionals, like teaching professionals, and write a curriculum from first grade to 12th grade that is all about an evolution year by year on how one gains tools to become more self aware, more spatially aware, and more socially aware, and just embrace awareness. That's if I could do something like that and create it for somebody else to use or evolve and grow from and expand upon, I think that would be a cool legacy.
I always end with this. I don't know where you'll be with this, but you lost a brother, of course, unexpectedly. Given your experience where you are, how are you on the legal front with wills and medical proxies and all of that?
With my father, my mom died a year and a half ago. So we have a lot of stuff. We're working on making ironclad between my father and I. And once like I'm his caretaker, like he lives by himself. He's right down the street from me, but I have to make all the phone calls for him and set up all the appointments. I organize all of his bills and have him on a plan and everything. So there's a few more things that we have to put in place to make it ironclad. And once that's done, I'm going to be doing that for my partner.
Okay.
So it's very important to me. I just turned 47 yesterday.
Yeah.
And so it's been something. Thank you. It's been something that like, it's very, very important for me. And I want my partner to be taken care of if something happens to me.
Yeah, I
So
think of it not only the taken care of part, but it's when people are grieving like that. It just sucks to have to deal with funeral homes and everything else when we can all get that set before we get to that.
yeah, we're not at that point yet. I have a lot more like joking things that I want my funeral to be like for her. One of the ideas is just to like is to have me. This is if I wasn't going to be cremated. I have probably like 5 different ideas written down for her that I want her to do. The funniest one that I love is that my body be dressed up and face painted like Heath Ledger's interpretation of the Joker, and that it's an open casket and there's like a placard on it that says "Why so serious?" and then a Polaroid camera on top of like the closed part of the casket that people can take one last picture with me.
Yeah.
Sharon's like, I'm not doing that. I'm like, you absolutely are. What are you talking about?
When I was younger, I used to make the joke that I would be taxidermied like this. I could be useful in death as a hat rack or a coat rack. So
Yeah, yeah, just like that's that's hilarious. I love that.
Sincerely appreciated you as a guest and loved hearing your story. And I know it's been a while and you've kind of brought it inward and grown from it. I know what it's like to lose somebody
Yeah,
close to suicide. And so, sorry you had to go through, but
it's
love,
heavy.
love what you're doing with it. Love where it's taken you and what you learned from it.
Right on. I appreciate you, Kurt. Thank you so much.
Cool, man.
You can't hang on to yourself. You don't have to try not to hang on to yourself. It can't be done. And that is salvation. The most important thing for anyone to realize is that you and every person you see will soon be dead.